Hey, I'm Alex, and I love making big, juicy, open-world maps for D&D, where my players can go wherever they please, and they know there'll always be something they can sink their teeth into. And recently, I started this process anew, creating this world map. So today, I'm going to talk through the process of how I made this freshly filled out map, along with how I use map making to generate ideas for a campaign, figuring out the world's history, which nations exist, what are the political dynamics between those nations, what religions might be followed here, and so on and on. When I dived into making this campaign, I only had two ideas. I knew I wanted to have different nations, and I wanted to have a river that runs down from a mountain. And that was it, which is actually more than enough for a jumping off point. Also, while this video is talking about making this world map and the lore that accompanies it, the plan is to go through and make a town map for every single village, town, or city that you can see, making quests to go along with every single one of them. I've already started this process and have over 10 town maps and quests in the bag. So a DM could pick anywhere on this map, place their party there, and know there's more than enough for a single session or an entire multi-year campaign. If you want access to all the maps and quests I make, including this map and the quest document that comes with it, then you can sign up to my Patreon. There will be new quests and maps released every week. There's also about 80 world, town, building, and battle maps available from previous campaigns that I've run. Also, I made this entire map over on Twitch at DnD SandBox with help from the community, many of whom's ideas are riddled throughout this entire campaign. They help with everything from naming cities to giving nations histories to giving prompts for entire regions. So if you want to contribute your D&D mind on any future maps or quests, then please come join us on the Twitch. Particular big shout out to Clueless Forum, who was a massive contributor to all of this and whose genius is riddled throughout the map and campaign. So thank you so much, Clueless. Love all your work. But enough preamble, let's crack open this map, starting with the only real prompt I had rattling around the old noggin. I wanted this world to include some mountains and a river coming down from them, so we started there. I went about placing some rivers, and while I was doing this, I decided that we'd have this as the only major water system in the entire continent, which naturally leads to the idea that whoever controls the mouth of the river and the main water source would be a powerful and highly influential nation. As we were talking the logistics of this theoretical powerful nation, I figured we'd create a world that has been in a decades-long soft power war, with the bubbling powder keg of actual war being a threat that could possibly soon be realized. This means there are many cities and nations that are ready for significant changes of all sorts, allowing for many opportunities for parties to sidle on in and create a massive impact on the entire world at large, if they so choose. With this base, we moved on to building out a different area. I figured it'd be fun to have a natural opposition to this water mountain group and put a fire mountain group. We placed a big volcano down and surrounded it with some very cool jaggedy mountains of its own. Now, there are lots of reasons why these two groups might be in opposition with each other, but we decided that the water mountain group and the fire mountain group would both be fairly religiously based nations, and they both praise their respective water and fire gods. This instilled the idea that both of these nations think of their particular element as precious and sacred, which would become a main factor for expanding out these places in the future. This is when Clueless suggested we make a forest that is made up of 4 sections that are each permanently one of the 4 seasons. We placed summer in the middle, surrounded it with fall trees, then messed around with continuing the encirclement approach, but realized it looked better if we placed spring trees up top and winter trees down the bottom. We also lobbed in a big spooky dead tree with a face in the middle of the forest. I have no idea what for yet, but we can narrativize the spooky face tree at some point in the future. I like putting down things like this on a map where I don't know what they are or why they exist when I place them, and I let myself expand out the reasoning and lore behind it later. To add some tension to the region, we included an industrial city that has infiltrated the space. We looked around for a location the city could sit and placed it on the river mouth, as that seems like the most advantageous spot to be. We also changed the terrain slightly so the 3 parts of the city could sit in different seasons, calling the 3 districts Winter Wharf, Springport, and Autumn Harbor. With our first area done-ish, we then moved over to complete our second area, the mountain river nation we called Silvervale. Using the protectionist law we established for this area earlier, we designed the nation to be rather gated off and defensive. We also weaved in the religiosity of the nation into its design. Its major capital city would have a massive dam they've created to control the flow of water to the rest of the continent. To be allowed to use the waterways, other nations would have to pay fealty to Silvervale. Otherwise, Silvervale's dominant navy would destroy their ships and blockade their ports. After establishing they had had a large navy, we decided that paying fealty would also give people not just access to the waterways, but protection. Protection from what? We don't know yet, but we had the idea in the back pocket. When creating the land of Silvervale, I followed a pattern that I often follow when making regions. I start by placing down the most significant important features, in this case the mountains and rivers we already had. Then I go through and paint the ground of the region. The type of terrain and the color of the ground are often really good indicators of what sort of characteristics the nation might have, or what they think is important. Next, I go through and place a bunch of cities and towns to fill out the region, connecting them with some roads. Often I'll actually build the entire road network first and then put the cities in around that, but I did it the other way this time. After I have a good basis, I'll go through and add some extra details to fill out the place, usually in the form of trees or hills, or maybe a unique item which can then be notable and something we can build out from in the future, like the dead face tree in the Ever Seasons. And that's more or less the order I consistently use when building out nations or regions, and you're going to see me do it again and again. With Silvervale firmly on the map, we then quickly turned our attention back to the volcano land, which we named Vulcan Rift. I wanted to make the cities here small, as I don't imagine this place is the most populated location the world has ever seen. I also added some dying wilted trees to match the nation's darker, drearier aesthetic, along with a few cracks around to give the region a little more to it than just mountains, even placing a small city inside one of these cracks. Narratively, we made this place a more aggressive, hostile area, with the inhabitants none too fond of people not from Vulcan Rift, even being known to kill visitors and merchants to simply avoid outside relations. However, they happen to have access to precious metals and resources that are only found in the volcano, meaning instead of leaving them be, outsiders are often trying to establish trade relations so they can get access to these precious metals. Metals that are made by the fire god housed in the volcano and in turn are sacred. Now, we could have made the water nation good and the fire nation bad, and I considered it, but I don't like nations that are irredeemably evil or default team good. This isn't to say I make all nations morally neutral or equally correct, but when I create nations or towns or people that are doing bad or even reprehensible things, I like to make sure there's a logic to it. They have some level of reasoning and justification for their actions or beliefs. So even if you disagree or think what they are doing is morally bad, it's not simply bad because they are the evil ones. Same thing with good nations. No place I make is good just because they are the good guys. I bring this up now because this is the type of thinking I use for everywhere that I make, and we'll continue to see this as we go. No place is really meant to be the good guys or the bad guys. The different nations have different goals, histories, beliefs, and ideologies, and any party could side with anyone and there would be a level of justification. I do the same thing when I write quests. The party can always choose to side with a couple of different groups or individuals, and any choice is valid. Check out some of my quest making videos if you want to see this in action. After finishing Vulcan Rift, I decided to make a region that resembled a bit more of a marshy swamp. This was quickly added onto that this place could be a much more dangerous area, with the woods being a place where death and execution happened sometime in the past. Using this latter suggestion, we equipped ourselves with some ruins and figured that this region would be a great place for a ransacked and now dead civilization. Nestled into the mountain, we placed a large and destroyed city that was once the powerhouse of the continent. The destruction of this city 50 years ago would also act as a clear demarcation of when the continent started to slide into the current high-tension, destabilized world we see today. This city's fall accelerating this process. Many of the other nations' tension points would be derived from this revolutionary change. If the old civilization had been destroyed, it made sense to fill it with marauders and pirates. This realization that they could be pirates set up the perfect counterbalance to Silvervale's controlling of the waterways. Now we have a nation who actively scours the river network, attacking ships and sacking cities, retroactively adding some justification for Silvervale's self-assigned status of water police. As we built the nation, we decided that the marauders can have adopted and stolen the culture and history of the nation they just killed, calling themselves the Old Guard after the ancient civilization that is no more. They of course have a more corrupted and self-serving version of this old culture, and the leaders mostly use it as a way to establish authority and demonstrate their power. Lastly, for the nation of the Old Guard, it was suggested that magical properties inside the forest were reanimating the many corpses which once hung inside. Some of these re-alived individuals decided to join the new Old Guard and dive deep into the old black flag waving, treasure plundering, merchant murdering way of life. Meaning this isn't just a pirate nation, it's a zombie pirate nation. Moving down the map, we respectfully ruminated over a nation that could inhabit the lower lake of the river network. For this area, we leaned on the Eastern style stamps contained within Incarnate, choosing to accompany this architectural style with some jungles. We expanded out the waterway a little, adding in a few extra lakes and river tentacles to make this whole nation that little bit more saucy. While placing the rivers, it was noted that these are the sort of estuaries that contain gold and even gems within them, so it was decided that we would do that exact same thing, naming the nation Gilded Fang. We placed down some thick jungle up top, which would act as a protective wall from the pirate zombies located to the north. We filled out the areas around the lake with a slew of fun-coloured trees, characterising these small forests to hold different valuable gems. The gem dust from the rivers has seeped into the ground and affected the colour of the forest and trees around them. Leaning on the lore that we had just established with this area, that they pan for gold and gems, along with the lore of the zombie pirates up north, we figured it would make sense that the Gilded Fang has built a large wall across the only waterway entrance as a way to protect themselves from the marauding pirates. A wall they can easily afford to build as they are one of, if not outwardly, the wealthiest nation in the world. This is something that happens all the time throughout the process of making a world map. We make a decision or come up with an idea that we apply to an area. Then later in the process, we build off that idea from a different nation's perspective. This helps expand out the lore, but also creates really complex networks of political association, intra-continent conflicts, alliances, rivalries, enemies, tenuous friendships, and overall deeper connectivity between the regions across the continent. I think the approach of figuring out one element at a time, then building off it, is often the best way when creating a sandbox campaign, because it really means the campaign world grows and evolves a little more naturally, rather than having an idea then forcing the world's construction to conform to that, which can sometimes make the narrativization stilted and shallow, although it can also create incredible stories, so I'm not trying to discredit it. I mean, if you do have an idea for a sandbox campaign and are able to write it out, that's great. But I also want to highlight that you can write complex worlds without needing to have anything planned beforehand. You can dive in, create a map, take notes as you go, and you'll naturally find yourself creating these connections that act as the basis for your entire world and campaign. Anyway, back in Gilded Fang, we added the rest of the towns, figuring out a bit of story for the different locations as we went, such as this island containing two rival towns, a red one which controls the imports of the various lake cities, and a blue city which controls the gold and gem exports. We also added a second wall lower down the river that acts as a second protection from the pirates, a wall which expands out onto the land, as the increased presence of Silvervale's navy along with the Gilded Fang wall has meant the pirates' seaside endeavors have been weakened and they've turned to more land-based approaches in the recent decades, waddling their way down to the south for some good old-fashioned land-based sea sacking. Realizing that the continent was lacking any real food resources, we went to fill that gap, creating a large agricultural nation. I made the incredibly bold and frankly highly commendable choice to add a second, smaller river system. This would be the only other real freshwater source available in the world, and as such it inspired a genius level naming convention for this river-based farming nation, Rivergrain, a small agrarian society which produces a sizable amount of food for the entire continent. I wrote a full 37 words worth of notes for this nation, ending it with, "It doesn't interact with the world much. Exhilarating." 4.5 hours in, we had about 2,000 words worth of notes and a strong start to our world map, and in the first of our 3 streams working on it. Starting the next stream, we buckled in by asking what's a new type of biome we can put on the map, and a desert biome is what jumped out to me. When looking through the desert assets on Incarnate, I noticed there was a new group called Babylonian, which I had never seen before as they had only been released less than a week prior to me busting out this map. This made me think something very smart. I should use those stamps as I've never used those stamps before. And so I did. The choice to use this group of stamps rather than the standard desert group would end up having quite a large impact for the world at large. The reason for this is the Babylonian stamps have gardens and fountains, which got me all hot and bothered, while the desert stamps have barely anything worth getting out of sweatpants for. I haven't mentioned this yet, but when making maps with Incarnate, I am often massively inspired by the application as a whole. This is things like the stamps available guiding me of what sort of vibe a nation has, what infrastructure they have, or even what exists in the world. It's also things like I can only makes some buildings so small. So if the minimal size is significantly larger than all the other buildings, then that place has a really big building which we need to justify later, which we can see with the castle building in the desert nation's capital. When making the capital city of the region, I wanted to incorporate these stamps I found particularly fun, and ended up making a fountain garden with a large statue in the middle. This started just as a fun design, but quickly became representative of their beliefs. We made this nation, which we called Oasis Sanctuary, follow the same water religion as Silvervale. Despite following the same radically named water religion, Silvervale and Oasis Sanctuary have different interpretations and relationships to water. Silvervale controls the water and believes that they have authority over it, but they also use it in abundance and within all elements of their adherents' lives, as they have such an excess of it. Meanwhile, Oasis Sanctuary's lack of water means they are incredibly precious of it and only use it for religious ceremonies, with most of the population drinking cheap alcohol as a water substitute. Combine this with Silvervale's tightening of control over water, and Oasis Sanctuary has been in an ever worsening dire situation. The creation of the fountains and the statue are desperate acts of a nation on the verge of collapse, trying to reinforce their power and authority over the nation, acts which may agitate and exacerbate the very problems they intend to quell. With the idea of a collapsing nation in mind, we made the second biggest city a combination of ruins and buildings, a city that has been ransacked repeatedly by their close neighbors, the zombie pirates. The unfinished walls are a feeble attempt at protecting themselves. We plopped down one last town next to the area's namesake oasis, then experimented with a road network. It looked hella weird and straight bad uggo, so instead Clueless suggested that they have massive pillars placed throughout the desert that people use as guiding anchors to get them across the sandy sands. As always, we were close to being done, but it was feeling a little undetailed and barren, so we went through and added a bunch of messes and different rocks just to make it that extra little bit more detailed and fun. Wanting to cool down after a hot day in the sun, we kickflipped our way to the center of the map, using this for our prompt. The next city is where the inventive and those seeking freedom from crime and arbitrary religious rules go, called the Cradle of Deviation. With this deviation, it made sense that this area is not a united nation like the others of the world, but rather a collective of settlements who are seeking revolution or at minimal reprieve from the ruling of their respective ex-nations. This isn't to say they are wickety wild with it, or raising anarchist flags. No, they are currently in the process of cementing a more formalized body of government for the main city and the region as a whole. But with so many differing voices and no clear hierarchy to go off, no leadership group has managed to grasp power for an extended period of time. Architecturally, we then took not from one or two stamp groupings as I usually do, but actively weaved in a mix of different buildings, represent the great diversity that this city would have. On top of this, as the possible reorganization of the continent is afoot, the region which epitomizes these ideals could logically have the largest city, demonstrating the sheer amount of people who are seeking change. I also kept referring to this city as the Cradle of Deviance, even though I read it perfectly correct the first time. From this misthought, I thought it made sense that the old guard zombie pirates would be from here and were the ones to initiate the downfall of the old guard. Was this a mistake because of my dumb brain? Yes, but hey, it made sense and built upon this area and its revolutionary themes, so it's canon. We also figured this place could have some airships, noting that in the future we'd need to create a more industrialized nation that is, at minimum, creating airships. These airships would help get around the old guard and Silvervale's control of the water and could be used as a way to confront and possibly even full-on attack these nations, continuing setting up the different dynamics for a brewing war which the world is rapidly propelling towards. This also extends out the alliance networks and varying political associations these regions have with each others. As the area also looks like a horn, the name Horn of Radigan floated to the surface, and with the region being named, we also had the name of the continent, Radigan. The next maneuver pulled was different from anything we had done before, shocking and dazzling all witnesses. Instead of making a region, we created two rival crime factions which have tentacles across the entire continent. I'll summarize the gist as it relates to the map and the world building in the future. The Kane Society functions as an advanced and semi-legitimized hierarchical crime organization. While they certainly do all your standard low-level crime, they are known publicly as an advisory group. They get assigned to political figures and financial organizations organizations to guide them. They use their voices to acquire power and wealth while spreading the Kane Society's ideologies. They have grown considerably in the last half century, as many of the old systems have looked for outside help to maintain their status and power. Conversely, their rival is the Cabal of Acquisition, a group of 6 of the most powerful mages in the world. These individuals established many of the thieves guilds and collectives in the world as they needed proper organizations to funnel the magical artifacts through to them. They need these artifacts so they can extract the magic from them to maintain and grow their own magical power. Up until now, their rivalry with the Kane Society has only been on this ground level. However, as the Kane Society are becoming one of the most powerful groups in the world, they have a greater conflict as the wizards of the Cabal have huge influence over the status among the world's elites, and they are finally being threatened and opposed by the Kane Society on this front. These two groups' presence and impact permeates through the world, but for now we have placed their respective bases on the map and kept their effect on the campaign in mind. Moving on, we decided to give life not to either of the regions these organizations call home, but rather the nameless industrial nation we had posited could exist earlier, placing the new nation in what felt like the most logical spot, on the right side of the map under the volcano. I knew I wanted to have a more industrialized nation because I haven't had too many worlds that have guns, airships, factories, or any machinery at all really, so I wanted to ensure some of that was in this world. We placed some of the cities down as we are known to do in a pretty standard scattered formation. However, once the name Assembly Line or TLA came to the forefront, we instead reorganized the nation's city to be more aligned, representing their namesake. While we did make a road system, we also placed down a railroad system that has been recently built. This rail network working as a metaphor for the spreading of industrialization across the continent. As I so often do, I looked for a juxtaposition to contrast TLA, and from this spawned the idea to have a more classic conservative fantasy nation in between TLA and the Horn of Radigan. For the next 45 minutes, we then discussed and devised the story of a war that came between these two nations. TLA and what we called Magasan. Magasan, noticing TLA's growing mechanization, declared war. Firstly, because they perceived the new machinery to be an affront to their conception of what society should be, and secondly, because they foresaw it leading to a huge power increase for the Assembly Line and wanted to beat them back before they possibly invaded. A preemptive move made despite the two nations having been fairly amicable for the last few centuries. Rather ironically, however, TLA then turned their attention away from making products for infrastructure and manufacturing and instead turned their attention to making weapons. The Assembly Line was certainly losing the war at first, as they classically had a weak military, a smaller population, and weren't as financially prosperous. After years of battling though, losing a couple of cities in the process, they finally advanced their gun technology to the point where their average soldier significantly outclassed the sword-wielding Magasans. Turning the tide, they completely sacked and destroyed Magasan's second biggest city, sending a message and finally winning the war. And for the first time in their history, they abandoned their small isolationist ways and became more imperialistic, establishing their own leadership in the various Magasan cities and towns, while forcing Magasan to become their vassal. This is when we moved their influence further west and made them have an outward alliance with the Horn of Radigan. While they haven't officially declared another war since their war with Magasan, the Assembly Line have engaged in a few skirmishes and battles, taken a few cities, and are building their arsenal in preparation for conflict with the most powerful nations on the continent. We finished Magasan by getting into the minutiae, giving some trees and extra towns, and signifying the end of the second stream. At the start of the third stream, we immediately continued building on the tension between the old world and the industrializing one that was gaining steam, pun fully intended. The idea was to have a nation that was fully committed to a more old-style fantasy-setting way of life and fully resistant to the changing times, giving it a fairly on-the-nose name of Antiquenia. Taking inspiration from real life, I thought of a conservative stuck-in-the-past nation and of course thought of the United Kingdom. With this in mind, I figured that we'd make a nation that was more spread out than the others, with a number of small towns and villages rather than having a few large cities. The main reason I usually make more highly populated settlements is simply because if every town has its own quest, then the more towns means more quests. So having fewer towns makes the future quest making more manageable. To get around this, for some of these towns we might make a few quests that can be set in any of them, rather than making town specific quests as I usually do, but we'll see what we do when we get there. The first town we placed down was one that sat across the river from the Assembly Line. This nation population would be a natural antagonist to the assembly line and themselves would be preparing for the war. This was followed with scattering a litany of small towns, connecting them together with an elaborate road network, then throwing down some trees and hills to make the area more filled out. During this process, we pontificated purposefully upon a possible political system the nation could have. To do this, we leaned on the main power holder the area already had, the Cane Society. While the Cane Society has been growing in recent years and may be agitating for power of the region now, it isn't the classic power holder of the nation. We call the current leadership the Council and made it a once respected but currently out of touch group mired by intra-group politics. It then made sense to have a portion of the people of Antiquenia looking to the Cane Society as a more modern version of the conservatism they crave. I still wanted to have the area desiring a more conservative existence and political system. I like having nations that have different political agendas and goals. This nation, like many others, may be fighting for change, but the change they want may in fact be an establishment other nations are fighting against. As in, other towns or places might want to get rid of the Cane Society's influence as they are the power holders, while the people of Antiquenia want to get the Cane Society into power. When it came to the council, we wanted a little more to it than just your standard they have old values. So we weaved into the mix that every past leader of Antiquenia becomes an undead after their rule and then becomes an advisor to the current ruler, making up a second group called the Council of the Past. This system worked at first, but as dozens of rulers have come and gone, the Council of the Past have become entirely too saturated. Many of these advisors believe they should be in power still and have tried to wrestle control. Worse even, there are members of the Council of the Past that have been deposed and killed by their successors, and as such, tension on the council is incredibly high. This naturally led to us creating the place south of Antiquenia, which we refer to as engulfed marshlands. This is a much smaller and less populated area which the Council of the Past have started to inhabit, splitting themselves into factions and having their towns inhabited by particularly die-hard adherents who believe these past leaders should still be in charge. This land is incredibly dangerous and populated with a high amount of monsters and has only really become habitable because the council are undead and not overly concerned about scary monsters. Plus, they themselves can also transform into specific monsters of their choosing and are incredibly powerful, meaning that they can protect their people from monster attacks. After having given the Cane Society a bit more juiciness, we worked to fill out their rivals areas, something we actually did before the engulfed marshlands, but I thought the explanation made more sense this way around. For a while the map had this area sort of filled up, but was empty except for some hills, a tower, and one forest around the tower, a forest which the wizards created. So the fact that these elements came first and then were added to later became part of the region's tale. It was a pretty empty and barren part of the world, a perfect playground for some of the wizards who were interested in being able to manipulate the land itself. 2 of the 6 would then have competitions to make more extravagant wonders of nature to demonstrate their power. One wizard created entire ecosystems in forests filled with trees, plants, and animals they invented themselves, while the second wizard made massive stalagmites come from the ground, replicating the most awe-inspiring and powerful natural phenomenon they knew, a mountain. It was fun to characterize the world as being created by people, or neo-gods I suppose, rather than just naturally occurring. And while I put these trees and rocks down to simply make the area a little more unique, I was really happy with this backstory. To its near west, we filled in the blank space Taylor Swift style and figured that the land between the most powerful wizard in the world and a massive volcano was pretty intense. We made a place called Dragonia, an area populated largely by, and hold on to your hats because you're never going to guess it, dragons. This would become a theme as we filled out the rest of the map. Lots of the places we made from here on out were made simply to give the world something new and different. Often we decided what to chuck down because the world was bereft of a certain type of biome, or I wanted to use some assets I'd neglected up until this point. This is exactly why I placed down these flying rocks. There's a cool floating rock stamp in Incarnate that I've never used, and I was incredibly keen to finally give it a ride. Massive magical floating rocks? Well, that made sense to put next to the magical Fey Forest. So we shimmied it into the right side of the map. One of the struggles I was having with the creation of this area was how the cities were meant to go. I knew I wanted to have some of the cities on the ground and some on the floating earth sections, but finding the right balance took a little while. I also placed down some dark blue stone buildings at first, but later realized it would make much more sense to have the cities be made from the canvas tents instead. This idea being heavily inspired by Thunder Bluff from World of Warcraft, the Tauren home city which sits high upon elevated rocks and is filled with large tents and totems. Narratively, we figured, hey, city in the sky might have airships, might have a relationship with the assembly line who makes them. So we made them have an alliance where the flying cities teach the assembly line the secret magical properties they've studied from the flying rocks in return for better airships they can use to make transporting around the cities much easier. From here on out, we didn't give much backstory or lore to any of the places and instead filled the blank spaces out with fun areas. We made a small forest in the gap here that had more jagged tent orc inspired buildings that haven't been used on the map yet. We filled out the bottom right with some large snow mountains along with a few snowy buildings, extending out the winter wonderland of the ever season's ice forest to naturally blend into the snowy rock terrain. Lastly, we made a smaller mountain group in the last spot on the map and gave them tunnels that connected through the mountains. While I do this all over the entire map, these areas best represent my philosophy on lore making. While some lore is created when you're making the big picture as we've discussed in some depth, much of it will be figured out and elaborated on when you dive back into the micro of these towns and create quests for them. This has happened already with the few quests we've made in the Gilded Fang, in the Flying Cities which are called the Bastion Remnants, in Oasis Sanctuary, and so on. All of these places have had their nation's ideologies, politics, history, and current situation fleshed out significantly as we've made quests in those places. So Iceland and Cave Place don't need to have determined stories or even names because that stuff can be invented later. Also, it can be nice to have a few places that have no identity to them beyond their geography, because you might think of an awesome idea for a nation in the future and these blank slates can adopt that idea. And with that, we have completed our world map. Sort of. The world map is not really something you ever really finish, and during the course of writing the script for this video, I spent about another 2 hours making small tweaks to it and adding details, and since writing the script, I have also made some small tweaks on top of that. For example, I added these rock forests to the assembly line, I made the rail network longer, I even extended out the river so Vulcan Rift has easier access for trade, just things like that. I've also gone through the campaign document, which just gives information about all the nations, the various towns, the various quests you can do at each town, that kind of stuff, and given it a proper edit and formatting, and it currently sits at over 10,000 words. If you're keen to give this world map a whirl, or you want access to any of the maps and quests we make in the future, then you can go check out the Patreon where there's already a ton of maps available, and there will be weekly quests and maps being uploaded there as well. And that's the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you are keen to see how this world and campaign expands, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I promise there are going to be some hot D&D videos coming soon. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!